Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that answers the question, what would queer Jesus look like in a sports coat? Joining me, of course, tonight is La Bianca.
Hello.
And our very special guest, we are joined by Dr. David Lay. Doctor, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about Dr. Lay's books. We're going to be talking about hot wifing and cuckolding and incels and all of the deep, dark, creepy corners of our sexuality and of the internet and all of these different ideas. So we would love to hear from you, the viewer. Please give us a call. We're here at 512-686-0279. That number again is 512-686-0279. We're very excited to hear your questions and your thoughts on this kind of interesting aspect of our humanity. And I guess I'll go ahead and jump right into it.
Well, let me pause you. Let me bust you a little bit.
Sure, let's do it.
So why you gotta say these dark, creepy kind of corners of our sexuality? I think that we do that instinctively, and I find myself doing that as well, because we want to kind of apologize a little bit. We want to distance ourselves a little bit from some of these more challenging shadow aspects of our sexuality and our personality. And I don't think we need to
agree with that. Yeah, I'll certainly agree with that. And I guess I'll kind of explain to the audience where my thinking is coming from, is that this is so often something that our society, our culture, all of these pressures kind of push into the corners, kind of push away from things. And so what we're talking about here is generally, in particular, men who are in seemingly or theoretically monogamous relationships with women who are then having sex with people outside of the relationship. And we'll get into the definitions of cuckolding and hot wifing and all of these sorts of things, but that's not really something that you can generally do in a public space. And I don't just mean the act of sex. I mean that it's not something we can talk about or acknowledge in polite company, generally speaking. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think a good piece of what we're here to do something about tonight.
Yeah, I think sexual morality and such, these social expectations around, you're not supposed to talk about sex in public, you're not supposed to be sexual in public. If you do, then you're a pervert. I think that's part of the problem. I think that what has happened is that we have this idea that, there's a certain kind of safe sexuality that we can talk about, heterosexual monogamy for the most part, and everything else we keep secret. But unfortunately, it turns out there's a lot more of that everything else than there is, frankly, of what we think about as normal kind of sexuality.
Yeah, so to that end, I guess I'm wondering why cuckolding is seen as so traditionally shameful. If jealousy is one of those sort of natural, intuitive emotions that most people seem to generally understand, why is this such a kind of specific phenomena?
So let me tell you a little story about the birds and bees, okay? Actually, just birds, no bees in this story. So the cuckoo canolus is a little bird that does this really interesting thing. The female cuckoo comes in and flies into the nest of another bird when that other bird is gone, and the female cuckoo lays its eggs in the in this other bird's nest. The cuckoo eggs hatch earlier than this other species. And then the baby cuckoo birds do something even more interesting. They push out the other eggs and they eat the food that the other bird parents kind of bring to their eggs. And it ends up that the baby cuckoo takes over the nest, consumes the resources that were intended for these other baby birds. And naturalists during the 15 and 1600s, they saw this and they said, look, that's what happens when a man's wife cheats on him. That he might end up investing in children that are not his, and his resources might actually end up being stolen from him and he could end up raising children that are not genetically related to his. So the word cuckold actually comes from the practices of this cuckoo bird, which were identified as something horrible and shaming. Evolutionary biologists and psychologists today would say that our stigma and our prohibition against female infidelity is related to this protection of our genes. Historically, it was about protection of property, about protection of resources, but it all goes around kind of identifying reproduction and female sexuality as property.
So this is really an issue of economics from a standpoint of sexuality as sort of a finite resource. It ignores sort of our more modern understanding that, we are not pieces of bubble gum that get chewed up or flowers that get trampled, but able to have vast numbers of sexual experiences without, I don't want to say without cost, because, there's time and energy in these different things, but there's not a finite number of sexual partners that we can have in a happy, healthy lifestyle.
Piece is, I think, valuable because historically it has only been a very few societies in human history where women were allowed to be sexually non-monogamous. Throughout human history, men have been allowed to be non-monogamous in many different circumstances, whether it was, King Solomon that had 1,000 wives, etc. But it was only in a couple of societies, the Inuit are one, Tibetan historical families are another, where and it was economic reasons that supported the ability of women to be sexually non-monogamous with more than one man. But in those societies, there was an economic justification for it. In the Inuit, for instance, the women controlled the household economy and the wealth associated with the family, while the husbands were off hunting. So you're right that the economics play a big part. And what's interesting today is that as female economic independence goes up, female infidelity goes up as well, because a woman who is caught being sexually unfaithful, if she's poor, she can lose everything and she's out on the street taking care of her kids in the gutter. But if a wealthy woman
Okay, well, we seem to be having a little bit of trouble with Dr. Lay's feed, so we'll be working on that. But V, so just kind of talk to me about being introduced to these ideas a little bit.
Yeah, having grown up very conservative Christian, these are not ideas that are familiar to me.
Sure.
Very, very interesting. And it's fascinating to hear the claim that people were always or mostly allowing men to be non-monogamous.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I've done a little bit of research on the Neolithic period, and around that time, 3000 BCE. And it was interesting to see because in that culture, that time, before the Indo-European tribes kind of came down from up north, it was very centered on female empowerment, and they ran the businesses, they ran the cities, they were the judges, they were the priests, they were the gods. So it's interesting to kind of see a shift in the way we talk about things, even all the way back to back then. Like, it seems like we're coming full circle almost.
Yeah, that our economics and our gendered sexuality seem really tied to one another.
Yeah.
Dr. Lay, it seems like we may have you back. Are you here with us?
It looks like I'm back.
Okay, you're back. Yay.
I apologize.
Yeah,
No, that is okay.
Well, we lost you for a moment, and it seems like we're already kind of talking around it. But you point out in your book, Insatiable Wives, which I definitely recommend folks who are interested in this conversation take a look at. But you mentioned that in addition to the economic complications and everything that goes along with that, that women actually tend to have a greater capacity for sexual pleasure, and that has been a I guess, an issue for the patriarchy for, as far back as we have historical documents. How has that sort of shaped our modern society as we understand it now?
What's interesting is that I'm in my book. I mean, I can't remember if I've referred to it explicitly in this way, but female sexuality and female sexual capacity is like a Ferrari engine, and guys are sort of driving a Model T. Um, it takes us a long time to sort of get worked up, and then we're done oftentimes much more quickly than women get tired of sort of sexual pleasure. Their ability to have orgasms far outstrips males. Um, Historically, many men viewed that as a threat and something to control. But there were some men who viewed it as something to celebrate and to really embrace. That was really the origin of my book, where I started talking about those men who looked at their wives' sexuality and thought, holy shit, this is really cool that I'm married to this person who has a Ferrari engine. Let's see how fast it can go.
Yeah. Yeah, well, with that, I mean, you mentioned that as economic independence increases, that female infidelity seems to also increase. So then why is it that we seem to see that men cheat at higher rates than women? Is that a cultural thing? Is that a biological thing?
So it's a good question. Infidelity is, very much a multifactorial kind of issue. It is affected by a lot of different things, genetics, environment, context, opportunity. What's different with men and women when it comes to infidelity is that men appear to use sexuality, and whether it's masturbation, pornography, or sexuality outside the marriage, as a way to feel better, as a way to change the way they feel, as a way to cope with negative emotions. Oftentimes, poor men cheat more than wealthy men. You can't really prove that by folks in Washington D.C. But what is very, very clear is wealthier men have greater opportunity to negotiate relationships. They have better self-control, perhaps. They may have greater communication and negotiation kind of skills.
Mhm.
Poor men use sex with women outside the marriage as a way to feel like a king, as a way to feel like that powerful rich king who had all the wives and harem. And it's an escape from poverty. Females don't really seem to use infidelity in quite that same way. A female infidelity is more often kind of tied to wanting to feel attractive and wanting to feel desire. And what's interesting is that in my book, I interviewed all these wives and couples, and this one wife told me the story I'll never forget. She said, when a man outside your marriage tells you that you're hot and want to have sex with you, it really touches her. She says, he says you're beautiful, it really makes you feel beautiful. And I said, what about your husband? He says you're beautiful too. And she said, yeah, but that's his job. And so by having these outside men treating her as desirable, it gave her this kind of validation um, of desirability and sexuality and femininity that she wasn't really getting within the marriage.
Mhm. Yeah, so there's a sense of power as well as just validation. W-
But is it okay for us to get that from sex? And that is one of the issues in our society, because we've unfortunately we've embraced this heavily moral idea that sex is special. We shouldn't get we should only use sex for love and relationship and making babies.
Mhm.
But when we use sex to feel better, when we use sex to for recreation, or when we use sex for anything other than that, we view it as cheap or potentially immoral or problematic or even unhealthy.
I
Yeah,
apologize. I'm kind of
that's
getting
okay.
over a little bit of a cold there.
Yeah.
But I find that absolutely fascinating. Are there other places or meaningful distinctions, whether in our biology or just in our culture, where our sexuality is significantly different because of gender?
Wow, you're gonna get me like shot. There, are we allowed to talk about gender differences? I'm sorry, I didn't get that memo. Um,
We've got 30
um,
people watching live. So
the difficulty when we talk about gender differences is trying to understand whether these differences come from within us, in terms of who we are biologically and genetically and everything else, and what comes from social influence. And the reality is that, female sexuality has been heavily suppressed by society, for millennia. And one of the interesting places where I really see some neat kind of difference is, um, male and female arousal to pornography. And so man and male sexuality responds pretty bipolarly to heterosexual or homosexual images. If a man is heterosexual and watches homosexual pornography, he rarely shows much physiological arousal. But women, females, when we show them pornography of any kind, whether it's heterosexual pornography, lesbian pornography, gay pornography, women's bodies demonstrate physiological arousal in a way that men's don't. Um, what's interesting is that men often psychological arousal consistent with their biological. Women often don't. Women's psychological arousal is often distinct from their biological arousal. What that means is that women are, for some reason, not paying attention to the bodily messages that are telling them, I'm turned on right now. Men are very much attuned to that. Is that because of biology, or is that because women throughout history have been told, if you show that you're turned on, then you're a slut? And